Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Michael Gorton from Russell Kennedy, and welcome to this webinar on legal issues for telehealth services. For those who don't know me, I'm obviously a senior principal at Russell Kennedy. I'm also the chair of Alfred Health, a member of the board of Ambulance Victoria, and have held various other roles in government and in healthcare particularly. And I'm joined today by Dr. Melanie Tan. Melanie is a senior associate at Russell Kennedy, who specialises in health and aged care law, as well as health privacy. She's also a medical practitioner, so she covers both fields, and is currently on the COVID-19 sub-register managed by AHPRA, and was previously a medical negligence lawyer and also a medical legal advisor in medical defence organisations. So welcome to you all here for the webinar today. We acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet the Wurundjeri people and pay our respects to their elders past and present. The seminar today is obviously held in different circumstances to the normal in-house seminars that we would hold. I don't think I need to explain those circumstances. And we direct these circumstances not so much to lawyers, but to those in health organisations and practitioners, and those who may wish to have an understanding of some of the legal issues and also some of the practical issues involved as well. We would ask that all people be on mute and keep their cameras kept on. And we do have business development tech support available to assist you if you have any technical issues. If you just go to the chat function and ask for help, someone will be able to assist you. We also have a Q&A button at the top of the screen. The Q&A is for asking specific questions relating to the webinar content, and we will endeavour to answer as many of those questions as we can after the presentations. If there are some questions that we can't answer that seem to be quite specific, we'll endeavour to get back to you anyway. At the end of the seminar, we also like to survey you to see whether you enjoyed the webinar, but also to seek your suggestions for future topics or other issues you would like to have covered. And so there'll be a link sent to you, and on the final slide of the presentations when we get to them, there's a QR code which you can use your phones to click on to also get the feedback survey material. The webinar will be recorded, and we will send you a link to the recording afterwards, together with a copy of the PowerPoints. We also have previously sent out a summary of some of the issues that we're discussing today as an article, and so we'll also forward that to you as well as a nice simple summary of some of the issues that have been discussed today. So they're the housekeeping rules. There is a disclaimer that this is for general commentary only. We're lawyers, of course, so of course there's a disclaimer. But let's get into the topic for discussion today. So telehealth is obviously here to stay. Telehealth has been around for a while, but there were all sorts of reasons why we didn't think telehealth would be as useful, couldn't be done, technical issues, not the same thing as a consultation, Medicare and payment arrangements not structured to suggest that telehealth was a viable proposition financially, but what a difference a pandemic makes. So telehealth is being seen now to be one of the key features of the delivery of health services. It clearly has a role to play, not a complete answer to many of the health issues that people will be facing, but governments at both levels, state and Commonwealth, have given a very clear indication that telehealth is here to stay. It's an effective and an efficient way of delivery of some health services. So in this new world of telehealth, what are the issues? What are the risks? And the first question to ask, particularly as a practitioner, is it the appropriate modality? What is the nature of the consultation that you're engaged with a patient? Is telehealth sufficient to cover it? Is it easier for the patient to come into a GP practice or to a hospital or a community health setting? What is the best way, depending on the particular issues that the consultation will involve? What is the nature of the client? Do they have particular limitations arising from age, impairment, disability? Are there cultural factors at play? And of course, IT literacy, particularly for older Australians, will be an issue to determine whether telehealth can be as effective as we need it to be. What are the natures of the issues emerging in relation to the patient? Is this really a triage for something else? Is this intended to be some form of diagnostic? Why are we choosing telehealth rather than a face-to-face? We have to ask the question, is the client supported on site, particularly with consultations and psychology services? Given the nature of some of the issues that may arise in mental health or other factors, do we want to make sure that there is family on site to provide assistance directly, should that become necessary? In preparation for the use of telehealth, consider and plan for the risks, given the nature of the consultation. Are you about, or possibly about, to give a very difficult diagnosis or have a very difficult discussion with the patient where face-to-face and supportive services may be more appropriate than a remote discussion with the patient? So thinking about all of those issues ahead of time to help you decide whether telehealth is the appropriate way to go and what are the risks involved in a telehealth consultation for this particular patient. That may suggest to you that face-to-face is better, face-to-face has less risk, and therefore telehealth may not be the appropriate modality to use. The limitations of telehealth, where it's not as physically close face-to-face, where you can see all of the facial expressions and other changes in the patient, again, can determine whether telehealth is appropriate. Try and recognise changes in the behaviour of the patient or the nature of the patient, whether the patient is enjoying the experience or finding it difficult or challenging to deal with the issues that you are dealing with. Ask yourself, are you competent enough and comfortable enough to use IT? As many of us, and I'll confess it myself, the change to an all IT-based practice has its limitations and challenges. So you have to be comfortable with a telehealth type session as well and know how to use it effectively. And also, I think, be alert and know when to call it. That is, know when telehealth is clearly not the answer and either a face-to-face visit should happen, or whether it should happen quickly because of the nature of what you determine, or in the extreme case, whether an ambulance should be called to attend to the patient if that's what occurs. So a range of factors to, first of all, consider whether telehealth is the appropriate vehicle for use in the case of this particular patient. On the next slide, consider the system that you're using, the clarity of the system. Can you hear properly? Can you see properly? Can you see all that you may need to see if a patient needs to show you part of their arm or part of their face or whatever? Are you able to detect body language and expression? Are you prepared for system failure, which may occasionally occur? And how do you get in touch with the patient? Do you have a mobile phone number that you can immediately call should the telehealth system fail for whatever reason? So backup arrangements, follow-up arrangements where that may become necessary. And again, recognise that limits on your ability to observe and assess the clinical indicators of a patient. I mean, obviously, you can't take a pulse. You can't check various vital signs. There may be some equipment there or people who can assist, but all of those will be limitations that you need to recognise and which may determine that telehealth either should cease or is not the appropriate way to go. On the next slide, in relation to preparation, you need to prepare the patient. So confirming that this will be a telehealth appointment, you need to explain the purpose of what you are proposing to do by telehealth and the limitations of what you can and cannot do via telehealth. Obviously, consent to telehealth and the risks of telehealth is part of it, just as informed consent generally is part of the preparation for a discussion with a patient and potentially treatment of the patient. Explain the limitations of the assessment of diagnosis, whether it's physical medicine, clinical medicine, or psychological issues that you're dealing with. You may have a consent sheet or an information sheet that you can send in advance, which deals with all of those various issues, and it can explain even sort of billing arrangements as well. So as part of the preparation before the telehealth session even begins, there's an opportunity to provide information explaining the risks and the limitations to the patient. Should you record is a question that many people ask, and in some cases that is an appropriate thing to do and a very sensible thing to do. But of course you need consent for recording, so you need to explain that to the patient and get their acknowledgement they're happy for that to be recorded and for it to form part of the patient record. Consider and check with the patient whether the location is appropriate. If it's a particularly sensitive consultation, are there other family around? Can the discussion be overheard? In psychological cases, there's always the concern that there may be duress on the patient or the consumer, which is difficult to see or difficult to assess if someone is otherwise in the room but you can't see them. And of course, you should be ensuring that you are secure and that you are maintaining privacy and the other members of your household aren't overhearing the discussion as well. Patient privacy issues remain exactly the same. So the next one is confirming the identity of the patient. So you may have set this up, you may have an email address, you may have a telephone number, but you may not have seen the patient before. So that may be a sensible thing to do, to have them put a copy of their car registration, driver's license, passport, whatever. And of course, you will need some of that information and confirmation for billing purposes. So checking identity is just a sensible precautionary thing to do. And similarly, on the next slide, privacy issues. There have been a number of discussions about different types of systems. Is Zoom, for example, acceptable? Is it the best? Does it have sufficient privacy? Are there issues involved? I know the Department of Health tends to use Teams rather than Zoom as a choice because of the quality of their privacy settings and protections. The privacy of the client in place, where the client is receiving the treatment, ensuring that they have privacy around them. And that's a fine balance sometimes too, particularly with psychological consultations, to make sure that there is privacy in dealing with the patient, but also that a support person is around if they need to be, whether they're in a separate room or somewhere else. That's something that you need to discuss with the patient as well, depending on the nature of the consultation. And of course, recording, you need consent to participate because of the requirements of privacy law. The next slide is about record keeping, and this is obviously very different to the sorts of records that you would keep in a normal consultation in a GP practice or a specialist practice, or even in a hospital setting. You would want to keep all the usual notes and records of the consultation. They are as much indicators of the nature of the treatment and what the patient said and what you diagnosed, as well as your defence material in the event of a claim later arising. But because of the unusual nature of the consultation by telehealth, you may wish to include extra observations about the patient's understanding, the patient's comprehension, any concerns that the patient raised, and if you think the body language was telling you something that was either concerning or confirming, then you might like to include a note about the nature of the body language as well. All of this takes place, of course, in the context of the limitations that we talked about before. So at all stages of a telehealth consultation, those limitations should be borne in mind, and things can change within the consultation depending on the nature of the information that you discern from the patient, what you diagnose as a consequence, and it may be that halfway through a telehealth consultation you really do decide that face-to-face is necessary, and so you would move to arranging for a more formal consultation. All of those issues should be kept as part of the patient record. So in one sense, record keeping is more challenging with telehealth, notwithstanding that you may be able to record some sessions. That's a lot of recording to keep on file, as it were. But you do need to keep good notes with a telehealth consultation, and in one sense, even more notes than you might normally have in a normal consultation, in the event that issues arise in the future, particularly medico-legal claims. So the limitations on the next slide, obviously be aware about these issues. You won't have someone face-to-face across a desk from you. The sorts of things that will be harder to assess will be whether the patient is being honest, whether the patient is hiding something, whether the patient has some hidden concern that you need to draw out of the patient. You will miss some of the usual obvious visual cues that you might rely on to frame the way you deal with a patient. Look for warning signs. So if there is some level of discomfort that the patient is exhibiting, or the patient is not engaging in the way you would normally expect, these may be all signs that telehealth is not the way to go, and a face-to-face visit may be the appropriate way forward. And of course, in extreme circumstances, some of those things may be warnings that the patient is experiencing something that needs more urgent treatment or more urgent oversight. And with any of those situations in particular, ensure there is appropriate follow-up. So just as you might refer a patient from a normal GP consultation to a specialist, you would want to follow up sometimes in writing, sometimes by phone, arrange a further consultation, ensure that family or support people are aware, obviously with the consent of the patient, but nonetheless ensure that the patient is fully supported through the process or from the diagnosis that may have arisen, or the issues that you may be concerned about. And it may be necessary that face-to-face is immediately necessary. And as I said before, in extreme cases where there may be extraordinary discomfort or breakdown, calling for family to intervene immediately, or calling for an ambulance. So in terms of medico-legal claims, it's important to recognise that the normal duty of care that we have to patients, whether we're a health service or an individual doctor or other specialist or other health practitioner, the duty of care is exactly the same. And you might say, in some cases, it's even higher because of the limitations of what you are involved in. There may be higher risks and duties because of those limitations. And so obviously being aware, alert to the behaviour of the patient, alert to the limitations of what you can diagnose by telehealth, what are the things that can be missed, what are the options for some diagnoses that will need further investigation. So telehealth is possibly a very good triage system. It won't in all cases be a great modality for diagnosis or a confirmed diagnosis. And so I think we need to sort of look at telehealth in that way. Clearly, telehealth will be here to stay for outpatients visits. So the traditional outpatients visits where someone's had some surgery, the surgeon has said, come back in 6 months and we'll just make sure it's all okay. If you've ever experienced those, you'll be sitting in a waiting room for up to 2 hours before you get to see the surgeon because you're all booked in block time. And the surgeon will look at you, ask you whether everything's okay, have a quick look at your knee or your arm, and send you on your way. And you wonder why you were waiting for 2 hours. Telehealth in those circumstances, I think, can be clearly far more effective than the normal standard outpatients arrangement. So hopefully outpatients in all of our health services will be transformed as a result of what we're experiencing at the moment. Obviously, because you're seeing the patient briefly through a telehealth consultation, be clear on the changes that the patient should be alert to. What are the other signs that would suggest the patient needs to call again? What are the issues, if they arose, would suggest the patient should certainly come and see you or another doctor, or ultimately go to a health service or even call an ambulance if things change over time. that's information you should certainly be conveying through a telehealth consultation, depending on what it is that you have diagnosed as the most likely condition for the patient. Again, having clinical emergency details available. What is the client's location? Is there a contact number? Is there a family member or someone else that you can contact? Is all part of the legal duty that you would have in relation to the client, which goes back to the limitations of telehealth. If they have a fit or a breakdown in your practice or in your health service, clearly you can deal with it on the spot. When they are physically located up to some miles away from you, that's certainly more challenging. So again, confirming those contact details in advance is the best way to go. And of course, in relation to any discussion about liability, ensure that you have medical indemnity insurance in place. I'm not aware of any limitations of medical indemnity insurance arrangements that would exclude telehealth, but it may be a question that you want to ask your medical indemnity organisation at some stage. The next slide is just to remind you that AHPRA, that is the health regulator, has telehealth guidance that was issued in July 2020, particularly in relation to medical practitioners. So the guidelines were issued by the Medical Board of Australia, and it does suggest that you seek advice from your insurer and medical indemnity provider to make sure that telehealth is not excluded in your policy, that you are in fact covered. Understand the regulatory requirements, and that notwithstanding that you are remote from the client, you still maintain records. Scripts still need to be dealt with in the usual way. We can convey them differently now because we can't physically get to people, and pharmacies are able to accept emailed or electronically transferred scripts in some cases. Understand the continuing obligations of privacy and the medical benefits schedule arrangements, which Melanie will certainly be discussing. And also AHPRA reminds everyone that the usual rules of professional conduct, those are set out in the codes of conducts of each of the health practitioner boards that sit with AHPRA, still apply in all ways to the consultation between a patient and a doctor or a health service, regardless of the fact that it's actually done by telehealth. And just to show that these issues are real, there has been a case dealing with these issues, and I'll ask Melanie to explain that and just talk about, from a medical practitioner's point of view, some of these issues as well. Over to you, Melanie.
Thank you very much, Michael, and thank you for your introduction. Yes, so this case here, 8CCC and Goya, was the New South Wales Healthcare Complaints Commission case. It was a decision from August last year where a medical practitioner was found guilty of professional misconduct. He actually operated a weight loss service by way of telemedicine, and he prescribed stimulant medications online. And the way it worked was that the patients had a consultation with a nurse who obtained a medical history, and then the doctor ordered blood tests for the patient. Once the blood tests were received, the doctor would have a telephone consultation with the patient, took history, and then prescribed. The patient also received an information booklet and was told that if they had any adverse symptoms from the medication, that would be followed up, and they were followed up by other people such as dietitians and personal trainers. The doctor acknowledged that many of the consultations didn't take place by video, FaceTime or Skype. They actually were conducted by telephone, and there were a total of 27 complaints which related to a 2-year period from 2015 to 2017. So the complaints spanned multiple issues, pretty much all the issues that Michael has just canvassed, to show that they are very real, as Michael has said. And as I said, this practitioner was found guilty of professional misconduct. First, it was found that his prescribing of medicines significantly fell below the standard expected of a practitioner of equivalent level of training. And in in response to this particular complaint, the practitioner actually admitted these two things which are on this slide, which he admitted that practicing telemedicine isn't always best practices, isn't always best practice without a physical examination, and in some cases not good practice, and also admitted that without being able to conduct a full physical examination, you actually miss out on potentially important information about the patient's medical state. And often in a telemedicine consult, a patient may not be as likely or feel as free to share their medical details with the practitioner. So, and in this case, in fact, it looked like when the practitioner, when the medical records were actually looked at, it was clear that some of these patients hadn't disclosed their full medical history. And significantly, it also appeared that a lot of these patients had medical conditions which contraindicated some of these medications that were prescribed. So another complaint was that following on from this admission was that the doctor failed to take an adequate history. He didn't, and in particular, he recorded the history often in a cursory way, so not in a detailed way. He would often write down saying history confirmed, and this was considered not to be adequate. He in particular should have it was considered that he should have taken a full pregnancy history and documented this adequately. He was also criticised for failing to examine a vulnerable cohort of patients before prescribing the stimulant medication, and in fact this was at the heart of the complaints. And also he failed to adequately assess the patient's general appearance, as mentioned by Michael. He didn't adequately observe demeanor, their capacity to engage or communicate rationally, their mobility, things like that. And those sort of things are difficult to assess by video, let alone by telephone. As medical practitioners, we eyeball the patient straight away and get a feeling for the patient straight away. We notice their gait, we notice what their skin looks like, we notice their affect, perhaps what their breath smells like, and maybe a rash that they might not actually identify to you. So those sort of cues are very easily missed, and these are not just visual cues, they're just cues that we obtain from being in the presence of the patient, and that's where one of the risks lies. As we know as clinicians, medicine, we say medicine is an art, and that's part of it is because of the instincts that we go by when we meet patients face to face. So obviously these are limited in telemedicine. Other complaints which were found to be substantiated against this particular practitioner was his failure to order appropriate investigations, his failure to undertake an adequate assessment of risks and benefits of the treatments prescribed, and failing to appropriately monitor the patient after prescribing the medication. And as Michael mentioned, there's limitations in checking vital signs and changes in weight, even things like an irregular pulse, things, red flags that might alert you that something else is going on. And finally, the practitioner did admit that while his patients were sent information, he didn't actually engage with the patient's GP. So it's really important to maintain engagement with other healthcare practitioners involved in the patient's care, even though you're using telehealth. In this case, the practitioner didn't contact the GP or seek their records. However, given the patients were actually referred to him by the GP, it wasn't found to be unprofessional conduct in this case, albeit it was not found to be best practice. I think one thing to remember, in addition to accessing records from other providers and including other telehealth providers, is that if you are providing telemedicine, you should also ensure your records are easily accessible by other providers or by the patient if they ask for it. Anecdotally, from other GPs, it seems to have been the case that records from other telehealth consults have been difficult to access. So that's a sort of, I suppose, just a little story, a little case to illustrate the things we've already discussed. I might just pause quickly now for any questions on some of these things we've discussed before I turn to the regulatory aspects. What do you think, Michael?
Yes, I can't see any questions coming through in the Q&A
No
section at the moment.
All right, in that case, will proceed. So with these lessons in mind, can we have the next slide? Yes, thank you. I'm just going to talk about some of the regulatory changes that have been put in place recently to support telehealth. As Michael said, it looks like telehealth is here to stay. It is indeed a very useful tool. Some of these changes are temporary at the moment, but we've yet to see how they will change after the 30th of September. So in particular, the new MBS item numbers. So as we're aware, part of the federal government's response was to introduce temporary item numbers for telehealth. As I said, currently they are due to expire on the legislation is due to finish on the 30th of September. Prior to COVID, there was limited government funding for telehealth, and they only applied to very specific situations. And these temporary telehealth numbers were created by the health insurance determination, which was made under the Health Insurance Act. And the Health Insurance Act is the act which sets out the legislative scheme for Medicare funded services. And this all commenced on the 13th of March. And they were initially available only to patients and providers who either had the virus or were vulnerable to the virus. This requirement, however, was lifted on the 30th of March such that MBS items are now available to all Medicare eligible persons for the treatment of any condition which is safe and clinically appropriate to be managed by telehealth. And that's important key there. The new Medicare items mirror other non-COVID related items, which means that they stand alone and they can't be co-billed with other face-to-face items. And I'll be talking about billing in the next slide. I just sort of pause here as well because while I'm talking about the regulatory aspects that have been put in place to support telehealth, these should never be seen in isolation with the issues that Michael has discussed. That is, the regulatory aspects always should be considered together with our duty of care. So going back to MBS, pre-COVID, there were about 23 item numbers for the telehealth, and these apply to video consults only. And while video remains a preferred medium for telehealth, the MBS now allows for phone consults as well. Now, just to note that while we use the term telehealth pretty broadly to mean telephone or video or sometimes even emails and any digital transfer of information such as images, and which can be synchronous or asynchronous. In the context of MBS, telehealth only refers to video conferencing. Services provided by telephone in the MBS are referred to as specifically as phone consults. And this distinction is important not only because phone consults and video consults, not only do they have separate item numbers, but video conferencing also has more stringent requirements. So both phone consults and video consults under the MBS refer to professional attendances where the health practitioner has the capacity to provide the full service through this means and safely and in accordance with professional standards, and is also satisfied that it is clinically appropriate to provide the service to the patient. So again, going back to what your duty of care actually is, and that they can actually maintain an audio link with the patient, or in the case of telehealth for MBS purposes, an audio and video link with the patient. However, in the case of telehealth, that is video consults, for MBS purposes, the practitioner must also be satisfied that the software and hardware used to deliver the service meets applicable laws for security and privacy. So therefore, if you do use video, you must consider how you manage your privacy risks and perhaps consider having a privacy impact assessment done or getting other independent advice. To date, it appears that the vast majority of consults have been by telephone, and certainly the department, clearly states that if you are unsure about the security of a video platform, you should use telephone. albeit, you know, even though video consults are still the preferred medium for obvious reasons. So it's a sort of balancing of risks. Again, you know, it's really important that if you do use a telephone consult or video consult, it is appropriate. And so if a telephone consult isn't appropriate, because you need to visualize the patient at least via screen, and you don't have secure video capability, then you should really be arranging a face-to-face consult. And again, going back to what Michael's just talked about, remember that just because a consult fulfills MBS requirements, it doesn't necessarily mean it will be providing the appropriate standard of care. And you should always consider the individual patient, and also, as Michael has already suggested, you know, observe any cues that you might observe during the consult that might suggest a face-to-face consult should be arranged. And again, as Michael suggested, always consider whether the patient does need more support given than it can be by telehealth. For example, you know, I'm aware that these days it's very common for oncologists to be contacting their patients by telephone and consulting by telephone and relaying results. In cancer patients in particular, and their families may need that extra support, which Michael referred to, which can't be given over the phone or even by video. It can be difficult to process information over the telephone and difficult to ask questions, you know, mainly because it's uncomfortable sitting there in silence over the telephone, whereas that's what happens in a consultation, where you know, as a practitioner, you can give a patient time to just sit there and think about things and invite questions. And I you know, I think that it's very important to think about these things. I speak from personal experience in this case that phone consults aren't the same when it comes to discussing really serious health issues. I think, you know, as a practitioner, you could think of other than arranging a face-to-face examination, think of strategies such as perhaps calling the patient again later on that day or the next day to give them time to digest information and ask questions, bearing in mind that if you do that, if you do call them again the same day, you can actually only bill it as the same consult. And again, I'll be talking about billing in the next slide. So again, I guess the message is, you know, just because we can do telehealth doesn't mean we have to, and always think about all the other issues that come into play. Now, also note that since July 20, for GPs and non-vocationally recognised doctors working in general practice who are referred to as other medical practitioners, they actually need to have a pre-existing relationship with the patient before they suggest telehealth, and that relationship has to be within the last 12 months. They can see a patient by telehealth if a patient self-presents to them, or if they are referred by another doctor, but otherwise they have to have a pre-existing relationship. If they've already they've been seeing the patient by telehealth, if they haven't seen the patient within the last 12 months, then they have to see the patient face-to-face in order to continue that the telehealth consults. Also note that the new Medicare items do apply to a range of practitioners. As I said, other medical practitioners refer to non-vocationally recognised doctors working in certain approved general practices. Another point to note is under the MBS, the patient must be present during a consult to qualify for to fulfil the MBS requirements. So a nurse or other health practitioner or a carer can assist the patient during the consult. Sometimes the patient might need help with communication, or they might need something like the temperature taken. So they can do that, but the patient has to be present at all times, and that includes, you know, in residential aged care facilities, that the consult has to be done with the patient present. The other important thing to note is in aged care is that that aged care providers must ensure that all care is provided in accordance with the aged care quality and safety standards, of which clinical governance is a requirement. So it's very important for aged care providers who are using telehealth to ensure that telehealth is covered under your clinical governance procedures at your facility. And finally, as Michael was saying, it's really important to make the appropriate referrals. Telehealth is no excuse to not make appropriate referrals. With pathology and diagnostic requests, there is no requirement for the request to be physically signed. The request can be sent electronically, provided the recipient agrees, and provided they can be accessible later and they contain the relevant information. And requests can also be made by phone, but they have to be followed up with a valid request sent over within 14 days. Could I have the next slide, please? So I just thought I'd talk about billing, which is what sort of MBS is about. So the GPs and non-vocationally registered doctors in general practice, they have to bulk bill for certain categories, and these categories, certain categories of patients, and these patients are patients who are Commonwealth concession care card holders, patients who are under the age of 16, patients who are at risk of COVID-19, and these patients have been specifically defined under the health insurance determination as patients who are at least 70 or the age of 50 if they identify as Indigenous or as a Torres Strait Islander, if they are pregnant, parents of children under age of 12 months, patients with chronic health conditions or who are immunocompromised, and patients with suspected COVID-19 or who are required to self-isolate or quarantine. Specialists and allied health service don't need to bulk bill, but always remember to obtain financial consent, as Michael has explained. And also remember that consent is also required to bulk bill patients. That is, a patient has to consent to assign their Medicare benefit to the practitioner. And this can be done online by Medicare Easy Claim, or it can also be done, the consent can be received by email from the patient. But for the temporary items only, if the patient's consent can't be obtained in writing or by email, doctors should get verbal consent for assignment of their Medicare benefit through the telehealth consult and then document this. The consent can also be obtained by the patient's carer or the family member. It's also really important for MBS purposes to ensure that you keep records to show that you provided an MBS billed service and the patient has consented to the benefit being paid by the practitioner. Now again, we always consider whether a face-to-face consult is necessary in addition to the telehealth consult. You can bill 2 separate items for one patient on the same day if both consults are clinically indicated and if both consults fulfill the MBS requirements, but provided it's not a one consult is not a continuation of the other, which is why I mentioned with the example of the oncologist before, if you invite a call back for the patient to ask questions, that should be billed as part of the same consult. However, if, say, a GP conducts a consultation under item 23, which is I think the most commonly billed item, which includes taking history, doing examination, doing investigations, preparing a plan, etc. If you start taking history and realize that you actually need to physically examine the patient that same day and you arrange that, then those 2 consults are considered as one. If you're the same practitioner who actually sees the patient, which is preferable, then you bill the consult which took the longest time. If it's not possible for the same practitioner to see the patient, then both practitioners can see the patient in accordance with the actual individual consult. And if you do bill for 2 separate consults, you do need to record the time each service occurred, how the MBS descriptors were met, and how they are separate services. And while, because telehealth is can be so limited, Michael says, as Michael said, it can be used as a sort of triage system. For the purpose of MBS billing, it can't just be used for triage. So that's just for the MBS side of it. So just remember, you can't bill a telehealth consultation if you're just using it for triage, because it will be seen as the next consultation, if there is another consultation, will be seen as a continuation of the first one. So again, as I mentioned, the legislative changes at the moment are in place until the 30th of September. We know that Victoria's state of emergency has been extended to the 12th of September. We don't know exactly what's going to happen yet afterwards, but as Michael said, it does look like they're here to stay, and there certainly is a push for that. I'm aware that some specialists out there are finding this difficult to manage, because often their appointments are booked up 6 to 8 weeks ahead. Just remember that specialists don't have to bulk bill, so provided that they obtain informed consent when booking a patient in, then they can proceed with booking it, and we'll just have to sort of see what happens. But informed financial consent is key. And remember that non-MBS services, can be charged. Fees for non-MBS services can be charged, but that is a matter between the private practitioner and the patient, if a patient is willing to pay. And while there is a expiry on 30th of September 2020, just note that there are an additional 10 individual psychological therapy sessions which are available until the 31st of March next year to eligible people. So again, look at the MBS online for full item descriptors and any information that's issued there. Could I have the next slide, please? So I just thought alongside telehealth, we have the issues of prescriptions, which I thought I'd talk about. And again, as Michael said, prescriptions can now be issued by an image rather than the paper form. Although the paper script itself is still necessary, they can actually be sent by email or fax to the pharmacist. This is again a temporary change to support telehealth patients and healthcare professionals, and it was made under the National Health Special Arrangement under Section 100, Section 100 of the National Health Act, and this section of the National Health Act actually allows the Minister to make special arrangements for ensuring an adequate supply of pharmaceutical benefits if they can be more conveniently or efficiently supplied under such arrangement. So for instance, in this case, patients have been prescribed a PBS benefit as a result of telehealth. So there are a few steps that need to be taken, and I've just set them out there. But importantly, you do also need to keep your record, the actual script, for 2 years. So this is a temporary measure. Now, can I have the next slide, please? Thank you. So electronic prescribing is actually a permanent change, and this is distinct from and predated the temporary measures for COVID, which I've just discussed. Another regulatory change. It doesn't fundamentally alter existing prescribing and dispensing processes, and patients can still choose which pharmacy to use. The prescription delivery service allows end-to-end encryption of the prescription. And so note that the technical framework and the PBS regulatory framework have been in place pre-COVID, so since 31st of October last year, and was actually part of the federal government's budget measure in 2018 to 2019 to improve MBS prescribing efficiency, allowing for greater choice, reduce prescribing and dispensing errors, and continuity of care in the context of telehealth. This was obviously fast-tracked because of COVID. The Department of Health partnered with the Australian Digital Health Agency and clinical software providers to have this rolled out since May, with the first electronic script issued on the 6th of May 2020. Just note that currently electronic prescriptions can still only be used within defined electronic prescribing communities of interest, which are locations that involve at least one general practice and a community pharmacy, which are in close proximity with each other. And they must both be ready to prescribe and dispense electronic prescriptions, because otherwise, if not, the patients might not actually be able to have their scripts dispensed. And once the trials conclude with the communities of interest, then the focus will shift to ensuring clinical software updates are rolled out to pharmacists and prescribers, and the timeline is that this should be rolled out by the end of the year. There are two forms of e-prescriptions. One is a token model, which is basically a QR code, which is sent by text or email or on an app. These are for single use only and not for repeat scripts, and they are scanned by the pharmacist when at the other end. Then the other model is the active script loss model, where active script list model, that should say, which at this stage should be available by September. In addition to the token, and there will be also so it'll allow pharmacies to have active script lists in their software for particular patients, and patients will just need to prove their identity to the pharmacist and consent them to view the script. So these are alternatives, but patients will still have the option of using paper scripts. So it's a choice. Nick, could I have the next slide, please? Just briefly, the regulatory framework that supports e-prescribing is fairly complex. There were other legislative changes which impacted the national health pharmaceutical benefits regulations, essentially removing the requirement of an electronic prescription to be in printed form. Under the regulations, an electronic prescription means a prescription that is prepared and submitted in accordance with approved IT requirements and in accordance with forms approved by the Secretary for both outpatient scripts and medication charts. So e-prescriptions will be available for both outpatient scripts and medication charts, and they will both have different requirements. So there are, so one of the requirements for electronic prescribing is that the person...
Melanie, we're running out of time, so we might move on if we can.
Yes, okay. So basically there are different requirements for electronic scripts, and there are 4 key instruments that support them. But also, in addition to this, be aware that there are 3 different policies that are available on the Department of Health website at the moment, and this is not on the slide, so I'm just going to quickly go through them. That they are, firstly, the Electronic Prescription Security and Access Policy, the Electronic Prescriptions Privacy Policy, and the Electronic Prescriptions Data Usage Policy. So I'd urge everyone to have a look at those. They do impose additional obligations for electronic prescribing that we don't have for the other things. So I guess I'll just go to the last slide now. So the key messages, sorry, I'm just going to get to my slide. So yes, is understand the limitations of telehealth, and this includes understanding the technology using, have a plan in case it fails, and as with all things telehealth, just be prepared and make sure the patient understands. As always, communication and consent are key, and documenting the process, and manage expectations, provide the information prior to consultation if it's appropriate, and document that you've done so, and always not ensure the patient receives it, but also make sure it's in a form that they understand, and always try and keep a copy of that information sent to the patient with the records, or make sure that you can access it at a later stage, remembering that links to websites might change and you might need to refer back later to what information you actually provided to the patient. Always maintain professionalism, not be distracted. Remember timeliness. Remember the concept of time on telehealth is different to sitting in a waiting room, so patients will have different expectations. Always introduce yourself properly and set those expectations right at the beginning. Again, always think beyond, think whether it's appropriate for this particular patient, think beyond MBS requirements. Remember, telehealth isn't a justification for shortcuts. You need to have a telehealth consult just as you would with any other consult. Document, keep good records, document whether the consult is by phone or video, its justifications, whether the patient's consented, if there's any glitches during the consult, and notes about the MBS, and if you had to switch, if you feel you have to switch to a face-to-face. Always consider privacy. The Department of Health has a checklist for telehealth consults, so have a look at that. Consider having specific privacy for telehealth and the need for a privacy impact assessment, and ensure privacy in your surroundings. Don't forget the full picture. Remember to always think about the things you would normally think about on a face-to-face consult. Be alert to unexpected cues. Beware of tunnel vision. Again, keep the consult under review. Just because you start a telehealth consult doesn't mean you're committed to it. And just always keep that question in the back of your mind. Be aware of the patient's getting uncomfortable. And finally, just keep up to date. Seek advice if necessary. The Department of Health does release updates as they come through. So keep an eye on that.
Terrific. Thanks, Melanie. I'll run through some of the questions very quickly that have come through. Philip asked about some years ago, proctors were suggested as being part of telehealth. There's no suggestion that proctors or assistants are required under any of these arrangements that you're aware of, Melanie?
Not required, but certainly proctors
could be useful in some circumstances.
Exactly. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, and as long as the patient is present, they can be used, basically. Yeah.
With consent, of course. Yeah.
Exactly, with consent. Yeah, and it always should be documented as well if that is the case.
Yeah. Abby asks, are there any nursing or allied health specific examples? I'm not aware of any particular examples other than to say that primary healthcare networks do have mental health nurses using telehealth as part of service delivery. There are a range of examples where telehealth or at least telecommunication is part of the system. So I'm sure they have developed materials for how they conduct their services. I know that the College of Psychiatrists, for example, has a telehealth standard that it has in place, which was developed a couple of years ago. And my recollection is I think I helped develop that with the college. But I think that's being revised at the moment. And apart from the APRA standard that we referred to previously, they're about the only standards that we're aware of, Melanie?
Yeah, I think the RACGP has guidelines, and I think some of the other colleges might as well. So always check if you have any professional guidelines as well for your particular
I
practice.
suspect there'll be a few in development at the moment with a range of organisations. Physio, Phil, asking whether when we show balance exercises to a client, they fall over during a telehealth session, would the physio be liable if the exercises are shown in a safe manner? Well, I suppose that begs the question, if it was in a safe manner, then that's probably okay. But given the number of people I see down in the park with their phones getting instructions from their personal trainers or whatever, clearly you'd need to consider the ability of the patient to undertake the exercise, making sure that they're in a cleared area so they're not going to, if they fall, they're not going to hit their head on something. There's a whole range of issues you'd certainly want to tick off before you started doing physio exercises, particularly with elderly people, I would have thought. So it's the usual risks, but just remember that you're not there to catch them if they fall. So you may wish to consider and modify some of the things that you do, or check with them at each stage whether they feel comfortable doing what it is that you're going to be asking them to do.
And I think if you think it is safe, make sure you document that and document why as well. So
yeah. What conditions can a patient or a resident get treated for via telehealth? Well, I think the limitations are, well, for payment, Medicare, the MBS is the answer for what it covers, but that would be about it. We have many clients that we have identified as ideally to be seen face-to-face for some reason, but due to COVID, we must see them via telehealth. I suppose this is an issue we didn't raise. Clearly, in the current situation, if you can't physically see a patient because there is a COVID issue, then telehealth is the only alternative, in which case I suspect the law would recognise the difference and recognise the limitations, and you do what you can. It's not quite the same thing as doing something in an emergency, but if it's the only way you can treat a patient, then I think the law would recognise that it's a different standard that would be required. But you'd have to clearly justify that it was the only way of being able to deal with the patient safely in those circumstances, to have a lower standard that would apply in those circumstances. But otherwise, document all the usual requirements. In any event, it is a consultation, so all the usual requirements are there. A broader question, what are the barriers to telemedicine? I think they're all of the issues we've discussed today about appropriateness, technology, the nature of the patient, what you can and can't do, the limitations are all of those things. Penny asks, what has been your experience as COVID has been continuing regarding the pre-existing relationship? There have been a number of new clients presenting for clinical psychologists. Well, yes, the psychologists are getting a lot more contact at the moment. We know that mental health services are under some pressure. So I suspect that's going to be the case. The pre-existing client issue is for GPs only at this stage, Melanie. Does it apply to psychologists?
Yeah, GPs and non-vocationally registered.
Yeah, and my recollection is with the psychologists is there's the 10 consultation limit, which has now been extended to another 10, I think.
Yes, until next year, 31st of March.
Are there any significant or important differences in the regulations and legalities of allied health telehealth services compared to GPs? The AHPRA Medical Board guidelines, I think, are really setting the standards more broadly as well, aren't they, Melanie? So it would apply to all of the registered health practitioners, the 15 professions within the AHPRA umbrella.
Yes, and also remember, there's still your normal code of conduct which you have to comply with, and I think the only other difference would be sort of in the MBS billing, in the MBS item numbers, where
Anne asks, can you clarify about scripts being posted to patients and if we can send the original to the pharmacy versus holding on to them?
You have to keep your script yourself as well, and the pharmacy has to keep their copy as well for 2 years.
Terrific. Now, I'm afraid we haven't been able to get to all of the questions, but I hope that has briefly covered most of the central issues that I can see in the questions that are there. Can I simply round out this session? We're about 2 minutes over, but to thank Melanie in particular for the presentation, our BD team who make us look good and have kept us on track through this process. Thank you for your attendance and your interest in these issues. As I said, we will follow up with material sent to you, let you know how to access the recording and send you the PowerPoints. We invite you to contact us at any time if you have any further queries after the session. If you can you please complete the feedback survey or use the QR code which is on the screen at the moment, at the bottom of the screen of that slide, or answer the survey when it is sent to you, particularly if you have other subjects that you would like covered in the future for us to handle and provide some general advice in relation to. We're more than happy to tailor our sessions to need and what is helpful to you. So thank you all very much for attending. Thank you again, Melanie.
Thank you, Michael.
Great team. And thank you all for your attendance today. Bye.